Officially, MKUltra was shut down in 1963, with most of its documents being destroyed by 1973. In the 1970s, federal funding began for the Gifted and Talented program. All this culminates in a project that has never been confirmed, Project Monarch. Did the US government successfully create Manchurian candidates? Follow me down the rabbit hole to find out. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the rabbit hole. I'm your host, Danny, and today we are talking about Project Monarch. Buckle up, because this episode is going to be a roller coaster. I know I was on a roller coaster doing the research for it. I'm talking like Nazi Germany, the occult, mass shootings, Jeffrey Epstein, so much more. Some things I did not include in this episode because they need to go on Patreon. I cannot just be putting that out into the world. Also, if you're watching this episode, and you notice that the background keeps changing, that's because we are under construction here at the Rabbit Hole, so the studio is going to look a lot different in the future. We keep moving things around, but I have to keep putting out episodes for you guys, so we just keep making it work. If you notice that it keeps changing, my apologies. And before we get started, I love to thank our sponsors. So thank you, Wise Wolf Gold, for sponsoring my podcast. Guys, if you want gold and silver delivered straight to your front door for as little as $50 a month, go to rabbithole.gold right now. By going to rabbithole.gold, that tells them that you're shopping from my podcast, which helps to support me. So I really appreciate all of the support that you guys give me, even just by listening every single week. But let's dive in. Manchurian candidates, according to dictionary.com, is a person, especially a politician, being used as a puppet by an enemy power. Although, in this episode, you will learn that the person doesn't necessarily need to be a politician, but are typically working for political needs. The introduction of this candidate was made by Richard Condon in his 1959 political thriller, The Manchurian Candidate. This book is about a group of American soldiers captured during the Korean War and secretly brainwashed by communist forces. One soldier, Raymond Shaw, is programmed to become an unwitting assassin controlled by psychological triggers while being publicly celebrated as a war hero. As Shaw's disturbing conditioning slowly comes to light, a fellow soldier, Bennett Marco, struggles to uncover the conspiracy before Shaw is used to manipulate US politics at the highest levels. The novel explores themes of like mind control, paranoia, political corruption, and the fragility of free will. This book was adapted into a movie in 1962 and then again in 2004. All this to say, they tried to convince us that it was just sci-fi and not real when we know that they keep using books and movies and different things to tell us exactly what's happening in real life. Since the release of this book and then, of course, the movies, this theme has been popular in movies and shows. Seeing many shows do episodes with the same theme. Shows like Gravity Falls, Rick and Morty, Family Guy, Bob's Burgers, All Hail King Julian, Salvation, Psych, and Chuck, just to name a few. But we also have this theme in movies such as Zoolander and Captain America. The adaptation of this fictional Manchurian candidate typically is in a funny way, which makes it completely impossible to have happened in real life. But maybe that's the point. Since the beginning of time, control has been a fascination of people. How can we control others? What can we do to make that person do my bidding, do what I want them to do? This need for control is based in occultism. One of the earliest writings referencing occultism is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's basically a compilation of rituals explicitly describing methods of torture and intimidation to create trauma, the use of potions, and casting of spells, resulting in the total enslavement of the subject. So, they were creating trauma, then using drugs and hypnotism to enslave people. Sounds a lot like MKUltra. These have been the main steps for a part of occultism known as Satanism throughout the ages. During the expansion of the Roman Catholic Church throughout Europe with the infamous Inquisition, they thought they basically got rid of a lot of the Satanism, yet it persisted, veiling itself in various esoteric groups. In 1776, Adam Weishaupt, a Bavarian Jesuit, was commissioned by the House of Rothschild to centralize a power based in the mysterious religions. It was time for them to all come out of hiding and come together. With this, they created the Illuminati. This was an amalgamation of powerful occultic bloodlines, elite secret societies, and influential Masonic fraternities. The goal was to construct the framework for a new world order. And they said the goal of the New World Order was just to bring like universal happiness. We're going to make everybody feel good. But really, they wanted to gradually increase control over the masses, eventually becoming the masters of the planet, which I know a lot of people can see that happening in our world right now. In the 19th century, Great Britain and Germany were recognized as the primary geographic locations of Illuminati control. That makes a lot of sense when you think about where the Rothschild family had most control at the time. The family was from Germany and was well established there, obviously, with the oldest and the youngest of the sons staying in Germany. But Nathan Rothschild was sent to England and he had the most success out of all of his brothers. So you have England and Germany as these themes where they have a lot of control and also where the Illuminati have the most control. Coincidence? I don't know. We don't believe in those around here. Interestingly, the first work in behavioral science research was established in England in 1882, while much of the early medical and psychiatric techniques involved in mind control were pioneered at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany. Weird. In 1921, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations was set up in London to study the breaking point of humans. Kurt Lewin, a German psychologist, became the director of the Tavistock Institute in 1932. About the same time, Nazi Germany was increasing its research into neuropsychology, parapsychology, and multi-generational occultism. Hmm. This was also the time that Germany and England were sharing ideas about eugenics. They were focused on improving the human species through the control of hereditary factors in mating. Nazism leaned heavily on this idea that selective breeding would create the perfect race of people. This is also how they justified their involuntary sterilization policy. And in fact, that policy was inspired by the work that had been done in California. So in 1933, California had subjected more people to forceful sterilization than all other US states, and everything they were learning about eugenics in the US, they were sending to Germany. Nazi Germany saw California doing this forced sterilization. They're like, that's a great idea. We're going to do that too. So it wasn't even a German idea. Top SS Nazi officer Heinrich Himmler oversaw the scientific project called Lebensborn. This project was focused on selective breeding and adoption of children, particularly twins. Adoption is a loose term here because the program was complicit in the kidnapping of foreign children with physical features considered Aryan by the Nazis. So if they looked like they should be a part of their Aryan race, they were like, those are our kids now, and they just took them. Then they called it adoption when really they were just like stealing children. The point of the program was to increase Germany's declining birth rate, but they also only wanted kids they deemed racially valuable. Not to get too off topic here, but the Rothschilds seemed to be leading the charge on this research, most likely funding it, I would say. However, the Rothschilds are Jewish, so why would a Jewish family fund the research into eugenics when the Germans were looking for Aryans and killing Jews? Maybe they, okay, let's like the happy, fuzzy feeling. Maybe they didn't know Nazi Germany would take it in that direction. Or maybe that's precisely why they did it. Anyway, Great Britain and Germany were bonded, not only through the Illuminati, but also through the secret society, the Order of the Golden Dawn. This secret society consisted of many high ranking officials in the Nazi Party and British aristocracy. So don't tell me that World War II wasn't completely orchestrated. Much of the early experimentation concerning eugenic engineering and behavioral modification was conducted at Auschwitz. They analyzed trauma bonding, eye color, and twins. Isn't it interesting that in the Gifted and Talented program, they sought after kids with blue, hazel, or two different colored eyes, and that was a really big thing also at Auschwitz. I don't think none of this is a coincidence. That's why I keep bringing it up. That's why I keep dropping these little hints that like these things are connected. At the same time, brainwashing experiments were being conducted on inmates at Dachau. They were being placed under hypnosis and given the hallucinogenic drug mescaline. And during the war at Colgate University in New York, behavioral research was underway as well. Dr. George Estabrooks was leading the charge in that research. He was working with the Army, CID, FBI, and other agencies, which was supposed to remain top secret, but of course, he didn't know how to keep his mouth shut because every now and then he would slip up and talk about his work involving the creation of hypno-programmed couriers and hypnotically induced split personalities. So this was happening during World War II. After the war, many German Nazis and Italian fascist scientists who were war criminals, they were supposed to be convicted in the Nuremberg trials, were actually smuggled out of Europe through the Vatican and then to South America, and then eventually wound up leading American research. Through Operation Paperclip and with the help of German General Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence against Russia, President Truman, General William Donovan, Wild Bill, and the director of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, reorganized American intelligence operations, creating a highly efficient covert organization. The OSS served its purpose through World War II, but the Germans knew just how to do it better. So the culmination of their efforts produced the Central Intelligence Group in 1946, and then it was renamed the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. So everything to come out of the CIA, we can thank Nazi Germany for. Gehlen also had his hand in the National Security Act of 1947, which reorganized the U.S. military and intelligence system by creating the Department of Defense, the U.S. Air Force, the National Security Council, NSC, and the CIA, like we talked about. Officially, this act's goal was to improve coordination and decision-making in response to Cold War national security threats. Unofficially, it protected the unconscionable number of illegal activities the government was up to include the mind control programs. Which brings us to MK Ultra. So I have covered MK Ultra several times on this show and referenced it in multiple episodes, but I keep coming back to the fact that I don't think this program ever ended. If, for whatever reason, you don't know or don't remember what MK Ultra is, let me give you like a brief overview. I will also link to the most recent episode I did on MK Ultra because I've done two of them if you want to go back and listen to that episode and get kind of a deeper dive into it. So all this research started with Project Chatter in 1947. This was run by the Navy to find out what substances they could use for interrogation and recruitment of intelligence agents. They were mainly experimenting with LSD. This came as a response to finding out that the Soviets had success with the use of truth drugs, although they didn't really know what the truth drugs were. But they did know that the Soviet Union had been buying up most of the world's LSD, so then the US just assumed that the LSD was the truth serum that the Soviets were using. Which I think is a safe assumption when like you realize that the Soviet Union is buying up most of the world's LSD, you're like, they're probably using that as their truth serum. The Project Chatter was officially terminated in 1953. 3 years after Project Chatter started, in 1950, came Project Bluebird, which would later get the name change Project Artichoke. These projects had a couple different objectives: to discover the means of conditioning personnel to prevent unauthorized extraction of information from them by known means, to investigate the possibility of control of an individual by application of special interrogation techniques, to investigate memory enhancement, and to establish defensive means for preventing hostile control of agency personnel. In 1951, when the project changed its name to Artichoke, it was because they expanded the scope of their experimentation to include offensive interrogation techniques. So this included hypnosis and drugs at that time. Project Artichoke was officially terminated in 1956. In 1953, they introduced MK Ultra. It's assumed that the abbreviation MK actually stands for mind control, control being KONTROLLE, which is the German word for the English word of control, the way we know how it's spelled. Especially because of how many German doctors were on this project. Plus, you can see the similarities between the concentration camp experiments and what they were doing with MK Ultra here. I mean, they were trying to control human behavior using radiation, electroshock, psychology, psychiatry, sociology, anthropology, graphology, harassment substances, and drugs and hypnotism. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist employed by the CIA, was in charge of MKUltra. LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs were administered to unwitting subjects under this project to see how they would react. The project also relied heavily on hypnosis. The goal of the project was to create Manchurian candidates or sleeper cells. And the subjects for the experiments were typically mentally impaired boys that were at state hospitals, soldiers, sexual psychopaths in state hospitals, and men in jails. Prisoners were great subjects because they would typically volunteer for the experiments in exchange for more rec time. Sometimes they would get like early out because of good behavior or whatever, but murderers were typically preferred because the goal was eventually to potentially assassinate someone, and these people have already potentially killed somebody, right? They've been convicted at least of killing someone. In 1963, the CIA's Inspector General's staff shut down the project because it was immoral. And let me tell you, it was immoral. But that's what they want you to believe. Most of the documents regarding MKUltra were ordered to be destroyed in 1973. This brings us to Project Monarch. Under the MKUltra umbrella, there have been 149 sub-projects identified. There could very well be so many more sub-projects that we don't even know about, but we know about at least 149 of them. One of these sub-projects under MKUltra is Project Monarch. The project officially began in the early 1960s by the US Army. It's assumed that this was unofficially implemented much earlier than that. And I say that because I think before the early 1960s, they had given research projects to a lot of universities, and we'll get into which ones in a little while. And the universities and laboratories and hospitals, they were all working on this research. And then once the research hit a certain point, they gave all that research to the US Army, and they took that and went with it, but that was around the early 1960s. That's when we have a definitive date, I would say. The name is derived from the monarch butterfly, and it's actually kind of sad if you think about it. So when a person is undergoing trauma-induced electroshock therapy, they get lightheaded as if they have this like floating or fluttering like a butterfly does. So that's kind of where it came from, but also there's a symbolic element to it, like the transformation a butterfly goes through from caterpillar to chrysalis or like dormancy or inactivity before emerging as this beautiful butterfly, which would be like their new creation. Monarch butterflies are renowned for their long distance migration. They travel between 1,200 and 2,800 miles, and they always return to their point of origin. The symbolism with this is incredible because if you think about a Manchurian candidate, especially in this sense, they get triggered, or like their alter personality gets triggered. They go off, they do whatever the mission is, they come back, and then they turn off, and the person has no idea any of that even happened. They just like wake up and they're still at home, like they never even left. Also, monarch butterflies are endangered, meaning there aren't very many of them. And then there's the occultic symbolism of the butterfly. So the word psyche in Greek translates both to soul and to butterfly. That is because a butterfly goes through a metamorphosis, and they believe that human soul becomes a butterfly when it's looking for its new reincarnation. Psyche is also a Greek goddess of the soul and the wife of Eros, the god of love, who is Cupid in Roman origins. She was often depicted in ancient mosaic art as a butterfly-winged woman. Other ancient mystical groups, such as Gnostics, saw the butterfly as a symbol of corrupt flesh, sometimes being depicted as being crushed by the angel of death. Project Monarch was a form of structured dissociation and occultic integration in order to compartmentalize the mind into multiple personalities within a systematic framework. The point of this program was to create alters or triggers in a person's brain that could be turned on. The alter would then go off, like I said, do whatever mission they're programmed to do, return the person to their place, probably like home or work or wherever, and then the alter would turn off. They could put any number of alters into one person with numerous backup programs, mirrors, and shadows, almost like failsafes. The alter is created through trauma, repetition, and reinforcement. To activate the alter, they use a specific cue or command. Sometimes it's described as just a word, or like a series of words. And in other instances, it included multiple sensory inputs at the same time, such as touch, sight, sound, and smell. So, for example, a person would come up to the subject wearing like a blue and purple striped shirt, then they would touch their elbow and they would have this strong scent, such as an unknown or uncommon perfume, and then they would also say a trigger word. So all four of these things together would trigger the alter. The subject of this programming is typically referred to as a slave, while the programmer or handler is perceived as the master. Because of this slave master relationship, this programming is sometimes referred to as marionette syndrome because a marionette is a puppet that is controlled by a puppet master. Another term for this programming is imperial conditioning. It's also called conditioned stimulus response sequences by mental health professionals. Of course, when you search imperial conditioning on the web, it has been masked as a psychotherapeutic technique developed in the Dune universe, which started as like the sci-fi book but has recently been turned into a movie series. Whereas a conditioned response is a common term most associated with Pavlov and his dog. So if you haven't heard of it, a Russian physiologist was researching the salivation response in his dog. So his dog would salivate when it was fed. So every time he fed his dog, he would ring a bell, then give him the food. The dog would salivate because he knew the food was coming. Well, eventually it got to the point where he could ring the bell, the dog would salivate, no food had to be delivered. He created this conditioned response in the dog, the salivation. The conditioning is what Monarch was using. Monarch can best be described as a form of structured dissociation. And that's how they start the programming. They start with creating dissociation within the subject. This works best in children ages 0 to 6, and they have even started some kids into the program while they're still in the mother's womb. They achieve this primarily through electroshock, but they also use sexual abuse and other methods to cause the mind to split off into alternative personalities from the core. They are creating what was called multiple personality disorder. Now it's called dissociative identity disorder in these kids. Further conditioning is enhanced through hypnotism, double bind coercion, pleasure pain reversals, food, water, sleep, and sensory deprivation, and a variety of drugs which alters certain cerebral functions. After creating dissociative identity disorder in these kids, they then embed and compress detailed commands or messages within each specific alter. They do this through high-tech headsets that emit inaudible sound waves or harmonics that affect the RNA covering of neuron pathways to the subconscious and unconscious mind. Sometimes they will also use virtual reality devices to project pulsating color lights, subliminal messages, and split screen visuals, which affects how the brain perceives it. They then use high voltage electroshock for memory dissolution. Every so often, subjects will need programming updates. So they will have to be brought in and their programming will need to be reinforced through visual, auditory, and written mediums. However, they got really good at this. So they decided they should start using movies, especially like really common movies like Disney movies or other family movies, to reinforce the programming without having to bring the subject into the research facility. I'm talking movies like The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, Pinocchio, Pocahontas, Sleeping Beauty, E.T., Star Wars, Ghostbusters, Bewitched, Fantasy Island, anything that might have subliminal messages that, when seen by the Monarch kids, just reinforces their programming. Sometimes it's the music in the movies, it's the tone, the rhythms, or the words that reinforces this programming. And most people watch these movies or have watched these movies. They could be on in like the DMV when you go in. I know our DMV, they have a movie on for the kids while the parents are dealing with the DMV. And so like these movies are very common. And most people wouldn't even be aware that they're actually reprogramming a kid that has been programmed in the Monarch Project. It's wild. And they didn't choose victims from any one specific walk of life, meaning almost anyone you encounter could have been a subject or a victim of this program, and no one would know. Not even the person that's programmed. Only the handler of the person would know that they've been programmed. It could be the homeless person on the street. It could be the CEO of the bank. It could be any kid that you come across. Like, you don't know who they are. And they did this on purpose. That way, they could use the subject as a plant or a chameleon for any purpose they needed. They could infiltrate any group with the purpose of gathering information, or injecting an ulterior motive or ulterior agenda into the group. 75% of the victims were female because females possess a higher pain tolerance and tend to dissociate easier than males. And many of them were from multi-generational satanic families. And we call them bloodliners. I've read about this for other episodes as well. So the Illuminati families are crazy. They will test their kids at a really young age, and if they test high enough, then those kids get to go on to be just like regular members of the Illuminati. If they don't test high enough, sometimes they'll just kill those kids off because they just don't need them. They'll be sold into like sex trafficking or human trafficking used for ritualistic abuse or whatever, but sometimes they are put into programs like this. Some of the kids in the program were then adopted out to families of similar origins, while others, the ones that were not of the correct bloodlines, are said to be expendable. So those kids are sent into situations that they probably won't come out of. The kids that are programmed that are not from the satanic bloodlines come from foster care, orphanages, and incestuous families with a long line of pedophilia. Kids with family members affiliated with government or military intelligence agencies are often chosen, and they also choose families from Catholic, Mormon, or charismatic Christian families. This is because they can use their religion as a front. So you can send a kid off and be like, oh, they're at Catholic camp or whatever. They're at Christian, like summer camp or whatever, but they're actually being programmed for Monarch. And the kids from these families generally took to the programming a little bit faster because they're already used to this rigid religious hierarchical structure that was paralleled in the programming. Plus, they don't usually challenge authority because they're used to having that authority figure. There is some good news, if you want to call it that. You might be able to identify victims of this programming. Maybe. They may have multiple electrical probe scars and or moles on their skin. Some may have parts of their body mutilated by knives, branding irons, or needles. Also, butterfly or occult tattoos are pretty common, although these types of tattoos are just like common in the world, so it doesn't necessarily mean that this person has been part of this project. And they could have easily programmed a story into the person about the body markings. So just because somebody has these markings doesn't mean that they'll even remember where they got them. They could have this really cool story about where they got their scar. Most of the bloodliners, so the satanic bloodlines, they will be unmarked because they need to keep the bloodlines pure, clean, unblemished, so their skin will not be marked by anything. It is believed that there is this deep-seated occult ritual when creating the altars. That the process involves a satanic ritual, usually involving mysticism, where they attach a demon or a group of demons to the corresponding altars. It is believed that the darkest altars are programmed in the bloodliners and will stay dormant until the Antichrist is revealed. Tying it back to work the Nazis were doing, they also had success creating twins. These are not like actual twins, nor is the pair even related in most cases. Basically, they would program half of the programming into one person and the other half the programming into another person, and then the pair is forever dependent on the other. They're basically inseparable. For those that believe the occult is involved, there claims to be this like initiation process that the kids have to go through. And for the kids intended to be twins, they usually go through the process at the same time, which bonds their souls, making them completely inseparable for the rest of eternity. The twins seem to have more pronounced paranormal skills such as astral projection, telepathy, ESP, and so on. There are different levels of the Monarch programming. Alpha is the regular programming. So the people that have gone through alpha programming are characterized by extremely pronounced memory retention, along with substantially increased physical strength and visual acuity. This is accomplished through deliberately subdividing the subject's personality. Basically, they are causing left brain, right brain division. Beta is referred to as sexual programming. In this level, they stimulate the primitive sexual instinct. So this level is mainly for programming prostitutes or people that will be used in honeypot or honey trapping operations. A honeypot operation is where they use sex or romance for interpersonal, political, or monetary purposes. sometimes to gain information from a person, but most often as a form of blackmail. Delta is known as the killer programming, originally developed for training special agents or like elite soldiers. They use this programming on unsuspecting individuals as well. So the subjects of this programming have no fear and are very systematic in carrying out their assignment. There is a self-destruct or suicide layer to this level, but they don't always have to initiate that programming. Theta is the psychic programming. These subjects have telepathic abilities. Interestingly, it has been found that subjects from satanic bloodlines have a greater propensity for having telepathic abilities. And it could be just because their family is so involved in the occult. There are many limitations when it comes to this level, so it's generally used in conjunction with various forms of electronic mind control systems like biomedical human telemetry devices or like brain implants, directed energy lasers using microwaves and or electromagnetics. Omega is the self-destruct program. It's also known as Code Green, typically programmed along with Delta, but this program will cause the subject to commit suicide or self-mutilation. They usually activate this program if the subject starts going to therapy or if they're being interrogated and too much of their memory is being recovered, then they will activate this programming as like a failsafe to get rid of that subject. Gamma is a form of system protection through deception. So, unlike in Omega, where they would kill themselves, this program allows the subject to keep living. So, they will instead use misinformation or misdirection to navigate away from situations where their programming may be found out. And a lot of the times in this programming, the person is deemed like insane, or they might be deemed to have schizophrenia because they're like seeing people or hearing voices that they don't actually hear, but really it's just their alters trying to get out. The CIA segmented its sub-projects into specialized research projects to be researched and developed at universities, prisons, private labs, and hospitals. So this is where that I think that the program started earlier than the 1960s because many times these places would get grants from the government to do research into these types of projects, or they would be funded or get donations from shell companies that were actually run by the CIA to give the CIA like this distance or this form of distance from the project. Some of the institutions involved in the Monarch Project include Cornell, Duke, Princeton, UCLA, University of Rochester, MIT, Georgetown University Hospital, Stanford Research Institute, where they were also doing remote viewing research we talked about in Project Stargate, Westinghouse Friendship Laboratories, where they were working on telepathy. I covered this in the bonus episode on Patreon, and Bell Laboratories, just to name a couple. There were a lot more. After the initial research at these major institutions, the project would then pass back to the military institution where they would keep the final product more top secret. I think what was happening is that the hospitals, the universities, the labs were doing the theoretical research. When they passed it to the military, they were doing like the actual physical research. They were implementing the research that had been done. Most notably, they were doing this research at China Lake Naval Weapons Center in California, the Presidio of San Francisco, Fort Detrick in Maryland, Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, Fort Campbell in Kentucky, Fort Lewis in Tacoma, Washington, Fort Hood in Texas, Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, McClellan Air Force Base in California, McGill Air Force Base in Florida, Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico, Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, Grissom Air Force Base in Indiana, Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, and Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma. So I included where each of these bases are in the country because, for one, most people don't know where the bases are unless you live by the base. And for two, a lot of these bases are near where trafficking is either very prevalent or where scandals have come out of. Later, we're going to get into the Franklin scandal and the Presidio scandal just a tiny little bit. I did cover those in other episodes, but the Franklin scandal happened in Omaha, Nebraska, near the Offutt Air Force Base, and the Presidio scandal happened on that base. Nellis Air Force Base is in Las Vegas, which is well known for human trafficking. Actually, any major tourist area is where human traffickers like to prey. So if you know of like a touristy spot, there's probably a lot of human trafficking there. Los Alamos National Laboratories has been named as one of the places where a lot of the research has taken place, and we know that that lab has a lot of ties to Jeffrey Epstein. And actually, Jeffrey Epstein has been tied to eugenics. So it makes you wonder what Los Alamos was actually doing there. Who is actually running these programs is a whole other question all on its own. So the doctors running these programs went by pseudonyms like Dr. Green, Dr. White. There was like a Dr. Black, a Dr. Gray. I didn't get into all the doctors. I only covered a couple of them. Dr. Green is assumed to be one of two people. Either Jewish Dr. Gruenbaum, who is said to have collaborated with the Nazis during World War II, or, and more likely, Dr. Josef Mengele, who makes a lot more sense for this role. He was actually called the Angel of Death because he did horrific things at Auschwitz, which was suspiciously downplayed at the Nuremberg trials. And then he seemed to kind of like disappear. Sometimes he was reportedly in Paraguay or Brazil, and other times people would just say, like, he's dead. But a lot of the program relies on his research from World War II. So it's suspected that he was brought to America under Operation Paperclip after the Nuremberg trials, which is why it was downplayed. Dr. White is assumed to be Dr. D. Ewan Cameron. Dr. Cameron was a psychiatrist who served as the president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, the American Psychopathological Association, the Society of Biological Psychiatry, and the World Psychiatric Association. So a lot of people saw a lot of potential in this guy. He was involved in the Nuremberg trials as a psychiatric evaluation for Rudolf Hess, which I think is where he met Dr. Mengele. And right there on his Wikipedia page, so like where anybody could find it, it talks about his involvement with MK Ultra Subproject 68, where he hoped to correct schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. That sounds an awful lot like Project Monarch to me. He was known for his unethical methods like electroshock, drug injections, and lobotomies. He even conceived the idea of psychic driving, where he would put a patient into a drug-induced coma and administer electroshock through a helmet, and this would last for weeks and even months in some cases. They were conducting these experiments on abused children who had been run through a Catholic orphanage. And even though Dr. Green and Dr. White were the doctors that started the program, it continued on with some names that you probably will recognize. Former U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino has been connected to this project. So I talked about Aquino a little bit in the Franklin Scandal episode. He is definitely worth discussing again. So Michael A. Aquino Jr. was born in October 1946. He grew up in California. He received his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of California, Santa Barbara, before being commissioned into the Army in 1968. While in the Army, this is really important, he served as a psychological warfare specialist and was deployed to Vietnam, serving with the Green Berets. So he knows a thing or two about psychological warfare. In 1976, he transitioned to the Army Reserves and returned to the University of California, Santa Barbara, to get his master's and then PhD. In the early 1980s, he was a part-time NATO liaison officer in several European countries. It is of note that while he was off duty, he would visit Wewelsburg Castle in Germany. This castle is so important because it was used by SS officer Heinrich Himmler. It's called Himmler's Castle. So Himmler would go there and create the SS honor rings, and they would have like these weird occult, like satanic rituals there. So these rings, I need to do a whole episode on this guy. So these rings were given to SS officers for outstanding achievement and loyalty, and it was the most sought after, highly prized award of all SS awards. They were created in the room that they called the crypt at the castle, and they were made in this golden cauldron, which they recently found, like several years ago. They found it had been thrown into a lake. It was recovered. These rings were like this powerful symbol of the occult, and they were made during satanic rituals, and the symbols on the rings also hold really high significance. So the main symbol on the ring is a skull and crossbones. And the skull is like this traditional symbol of the SS. And around the ring were Armenian runes created by an Austrian mystic and a Germanic revivalist. The sig, Hegel, swastika, and double rune were represented around the ring. The sig rune represents the power of the sun and conquering energy. The Hegel rune meant to enclose the universe in you and to control the universe. The swastika was the influential symbol of the power of the Aryan race, and the double runes were said to be a sign of salvation. If an SS soldier died, an SS officer who had one of these rings, somebody else would go and take the ring off their hand because they could then harness the energy of all that had fallen before it. Super, super satanic. Anyway, back to Michael Aquino. This castle obviously had significant occult history. One thing to know about Aquino is he joined the Church of Satan under Anton LaVey in 1969, the year after he joined the army. Anton LaVey, his daughter is the one that's the doppelganger to Taylor Swift, just so we're making all the connections here. Aquino and LaVey had disagreements about how the church should be run, which led to Aquino eventually leaving the church in 1975, but he didn't leave his love for Satan and the occult. He went on to found the Temple of Set, Set being the name Satan told Aquino he wanted to be called, after the people of ancient Egypt. Aquino was named in connection with the Presidio Army Base's Child Development Center's sexual abuse scandal in 1986. And then he was also named in connection to the Franklin scandal in 1988. All this to say, with his background in psychological warfare while in the army, his taste for the occult, and his lack of empathy for humans in general, him being named as one of the leaders of Project Monarch makes a lot of sense. And in fact, he was put into the position of master programmer. He developed training tapes on how to create a Monarch slave, and he worked as a liaison between the intelligence agencies and various criminal organizations and occult groups to distribute the Monarch slaves. I had Austin Wade Pickard on the podcast, and at the end of that episode, it's like 2 hours long, he shared a video of Paul Benassi. Paul was a victim of this Monarch programming and expressed what had happened to him in a police interrogation. He named the program, Monarch, and Aquino as one of the programmers along with Commander Bill Plemons. Paul stated that he had actually been taken to California, to Bohemian Grove, where he and others that he was with were used to satisfy the darkest, most deviant lusts of the men there. Among so many other things. He was used in like blackmail schemes and all these other schemes. He was used, this poor guy, he was used for all kinds of things. But outside of Paul, there have been some other pretty big names associated with MK Ultra and Project Monarch. Lee Harvey Oswald, JFK's assassin, Saran, RFK's assassin, Charlie Manson, who's like this cult leader and mastermind behind the murder of actress Sharon Tate and the LaBianca family, John Hinckley Jr., who attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan. By the way, this guy was found not guilty by reasons of insanity, which is common for people with this programming. Mark Chapman, John Lennon's murderer, David Koresh, who is the leader of the Branch Davidian cult in Waco, Texas, Timothy McVeigh, who's the Oklahoma City bomber. But the programming hasn't stopped. There has been strong evidence to suggest that Dylan and Eric, the shooters from Columbine High School, were subject of this project. And James Holmes, the guy that shot up the theater in Aurora, Colorado, he actually pleaded not guilty for reasons of insanity, stating schizoaffective disorder, but was ultimately found guilty of all counts. Next week, we'll be covering the Columbine shooting because I think that's really important to connect those pieces and how that shooting does not make any sense the way that they told us that it is. But until then, my friends, stay skeptical, and I will see you all next week. Hey friends, The Rabbit Hole is an independent podcast written, hosted, and produced by me, Danny Mercy. Special thanks to Lindsay for research and writing. If you love the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you're listening. Follow us on social media at rabbit.holepodcast and visit our website at stayskeptical.com for everything else.